Chapter 17. Bryce slung Edward over his shoulder. He started to walk. "I come to get you for Sarah Ruth," Bryce said. "You don't know Sarah Ruth. She's my sister. She's sick. She had her a baby doll made of china. She loved that baby doll, but he broke it. He broke it. He was drunk and stepped on that baby's head and smashed it into 100 million pieces. Them pieces was so small I couldn't make them go back to there. I couldn't. I tried and tried." At this point in the story, Bryce stopped walking and shook his head and wiped at his nose with the back of his hand. "Sarah Ruth ain't had nothing to play with since he won't buy her nothing. He says she don't need nothing. He says she don't need nothing because she ain't gonna live. But he don't know." Bryce started to walk again. "He don't know," he said. Who he was not clear to Edward. What was clear was that he was being taken to a child to make up for the loss of a doll. A doll. How Edward loathed dolls, and to be thought of as a likely replacement for a doll offended him. But still, it was, he had to admit, a highly preferable alternative to hanging by his ears from a post. The house in which Bryce and Sarah Ruth lived was so small and crooked that Edward did not believe at first that it was a house. He mistook it instead for a chicken coop. Inside there were 2 beds and a kerosene lamp and not much else. Bryce laid Edward at the foot of the beds and then lit the lamp. "Sarah," Bryce whispered. "Sarah Ruth? You got to wake up now, honey. I brung you something." He took the harmonica out of his pocket and played the beginning of a simple melody. The little girl sat up in her bed and immediately started to cough. Bryce put his hand on her back. "That's all right," he told her. "That's okay." She was young, maybe 4 years old, and she had white blonde hair, and even in the poor light of the lamp, Edward could see that her eyes were the same gold-flecked brown as Bryce's. "That's right," said Bryce. "You go on ahead and cough." Sarah Ruth obliged him. She coughed and coughed and coughed. On the wall of the cabin, the kerosene light cast her trembling shadow, hunched over and small. The coughing was the saddest sound that Edward had ever heard, sadder even than the mournful call of the whip poor will. Finally, Sarah Ruth stopped. Bryce said, "You want to see what I brung you?" Sarah Ruth nodded. "You got to close your eyes." The girl closed her eyes. Bryce picked up Edward and held him so that he was standing straight, like a soldier, at the end of the bed. "All right, now you can open them." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes, and Bryce moved Edward's china legs and china arms so it looked as if he was dancing. Sarah Ruth laughed and clapped her hands. "Rabbit," she said. "He's for you, honey," said Bryce. Sarah Ruth looked first at Edward, and then at Bryce, and then back at Edward again, her eyes wide and disbelieving. "He's yours." "Mine?" Sarah Ruth, Edward was soon to discover, rarely said more than 1 word at a time. Words, at least several of them strung together, made her cough. She limited herself. She said only what needed to be said. "Yours," said Bryce. "I got him special for you." This knowledge provoked another fit of coughing in Sarah Ruth, and she hunched over again. When the fit was done, she uncurled herself and held out her arms. "That's right," said Bryce. He handed Edward to her. "Baby," said Sarah Ruth. She rocked Edward back and forth and stared down at him and smiled. Never in his life had Edward been cradled like a baby. Abilene had not done that, nor had Nellie, and most certainly Bull had not. It was a singular sensation to be held so gently and yet so fiercely, to be stared down at with so much love. Edward felt the whole of his china body flood with warmth. "You going to give him a name, honey?" Bryce asked. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth without taking her eye off Edward. "Jangles, huh? That's a good name. I like that name." Bryce patted Sarah Ruth on the head. She continued to stare down at Edward. "Hush," she said to Edward as she rocked him back and forth. From the minute I first seen him, said Bryce, I knew he belonged to you. I said to myself, that rabbit is for Sarah Ruth for sure. Jangles, mumbled Sarah Ruth. Outside the cabin, thunder cracked, and then came the sound of rain falling on the Tin Ruth. Sarah Ruth rocked Edward back and forth, and Bryce took out his harmonica and started to play, making his song keep rhythm with the ring. Chapter 18. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in a bed coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, I ain't never. It's a baby doll, said Bryce. Don't look like no baby doll to me. Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. Then he was certain was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth between coughs. She held out her arms. He's hers, said Bryce. He belongs to her. The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. It don't matter anyway, said the father. It don't make no difference, none of it. It does so matter, said Bryce. Don't you sass me, said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across the mouth, and then he turned and left the house. You ain't got to worry about him, said Bryce to Edward. He ain't nothing but a bully. And besides, he don't hardly ever come home. Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. Pretty, she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them in different patterns. Sometimes when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one of the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort very annoying, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth had the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. You eat that up all, honey. Let me hold Jangles, said Bryce. Him and me got a surprise for you. Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with his pocket knife he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wood. See, all day I've been thinking about it, Bryce said. What we're going to do is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room. You eating that biscuit? Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. Uh-huh, said Sarah Ruth. You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you. Bryce stood up. Close your eyes, he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, Okay, you can open them now. Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. Dance, Jangles, said Bryce. And then, moving the strings with the sticks with his one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway. And the whole while at the same time, with his other hand, he held on to the harmonica and played a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. You want some fresh air? He asked her. Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh? Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely, so high above the world, she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. She wants you, too, he said. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, You got to look for falling stars. Them are the ones with magic. They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. There, she said, and she pointed to a star streaking through the night sky. Make a wish, honey, Bryce said, his voice high and tight. That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want. And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Chapter 19. The days passed, the sun rose, and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home, and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy, and he did not care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled, and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death, and it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce, and at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, then 2, then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat, and in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember, in between breaths, what to do, what breathing was. Breathe, honey. Bryce stood over her and said. Breathe, thought Edward, from deep inside the well of her arms. Please, please breathe. Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. Oh no, said Bryce. Oh honey, take a little breath, please. Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. You can't cry, Bryce shouted. You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love. I loved her, said the father. I loved her. I loved her too, thought Edward. I loved her, and now she is gone. How could this be? He wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued, and then there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. She ain't yours, Bryce screamed. You can't take her. She ain't yours. But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself, and then finally the boy picked up Edward. Come on, Jangles, Bryce said. We're leaving. We're going to Memphis. Chapter 20. How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life? Bryce said to Edward. I can tell you how many I've seen. 1. You. That's how you and me are going to make some money. I see it the last time I was in Memphis. Folks put on any kind of show right there on the street corner, and people pay them for it. I seen it. The walk to town took all night. Bryce walked without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back. The feeling he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden. The feeling that nothing mattered, and that nothing would ever matter again. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body hurt. He ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted her to he wanted her to hold him. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but it was not for Sarah Ruth. Edward danced for strangers on a dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. On the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside. Mama, said a small child, look at that bunny. I want to touch him. He reached out his hand for Edward. No, said the mother, dirty. She pulled the child back away from Edward. Nasty, she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. It's a sin to dance, he said. And then after a long pause, he said, it's particular sin for rabbits to dance. The man took off his hat and held it over his heart. He stood and watched the boy and the rabbit for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange, dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce started to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement, but the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman leaning on a cane stepped up close to them. She stared at Edward with deep, dark eyes. Pellegrina? Thought the dancing rabbit. She nodded at him. Look at me, he said to her. His arms and legs jerked. Look at me. You got your wish. I have learned how to love. And it's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me. The old woman turned and hobbled away. Come back, thought Edward. Fix me. Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster. Finally, when the sun was gone and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. I'm done now, he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. I ain't going to cry anymore. Bryce wiped his nose and his eyes with the back of his hand. He picked up the button box and looked inside it. We got us enough money to get something to eat. Come on, Jangles.